Hey everybody on Facebook Live, my name is Frank Washkuch, I'm the news director at PRWeek, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Eric Sedler of Kivvit this week. Eric, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Great, thanks for having me, I'm looking forward to it.
And Diana Bradley is here as our sidekick as usual. Diana, how you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Good, good. Okay, so we're going to start officially recording for our listeners and not viewers on Facebook Live in 3, 2. Hello everybody, this is Frank Washkuch. I'm the news director at PRWeek and MM&M, and this is the PRWeek podcast. Our special guest this week is Eric Sedler of Kivvit. Eric, how are you?
Good, great to be here.
Is the weather here in New York a respite from Chicago or not really this week?
Well, you know, it's all rainy here, but Chicago, I left the bitter cold and snow, so on balance, I'll take a little wet weather.
Okay, fair enough.
You just missed the horribly brutal cold here.
I heard.
So,
I heard.
It was
I'll take rain
-2
over
for
that.
us, which I think is probably what you're used to a lot.
Yeah, one thing about Chicago can manage weather and snow pretty well.
Mhm.
You know, we have an office in DC, and every once in a while there's a big snow, you know, there's like 2 inches of snow and nobody's working, and yeah, it's a little weird for us.
It gets critical in a hurry, doesn't
Yeah, I
it?
know.
All right, so enough weather banter to start. Diana Bradley is also here with us this week. Diana, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so Eric, tell us a little bit about how you got started at Kivvit, really Kivvit's predecessor, and your background before that.
Well, starts in 2002. I was very lucky that I had a relationship with David Axelrod, also from Chicago, obviously, and I was running a public affairs division at AT&T, and I was lucky enough to get connected to David, and we had some conversations, and eventually he gave me a great opportunity. David obviously was always focused on political work, but had opportunities from time to time to get more into public affairs. And he said, hey, if you ever want to come over and start a public affairs practice, you're welcome to do that. And so that's what I did. It was, looking back on it, it's sort of funny. We had no employment agreement or anything. It was just like, hey, come on over and let's go do this. And so it turned out to be just a wonderful relationship. But that was the beginning of it. So there was the political firm, and then I was the one employee working at what the time was ASK Public Strategies. And that's how it started. And it was really, pre-Obama. And so lots of growth and iterations of the company over the years, but that was the beginning. It was 3 of us.
So it was kind of a handshake and a beer agreement. Or maybe a beer and a handshake.
It was a handshake, a few emails, and it just turned out to be a great relationship.
So what was it like being, as you called it, the one non-political employee there, the one non-political partner? You were working on corporate work most of the time, and were most of your clients Chicago-based or across the board?
Yeah, at the time we had one client, a wonderful company called Axelrod, which I'm happy to say is still a client today. So I was the only employee, and I would kind of beg and borrow people and resources to get work done. But yeah, it was one employee, one client, and it grew from there. The truth is, looking back 2002, it seems like a lifetime ago. I feel like it was maybe a little easier back then. We weren't expected to do digital and social and all the different elements that go into communication today. So we basically did advisory work, and we would do advertising, and really from 2002 until David left to go into the White House at the end of 2008, it was pretty much that. It was, we were about, I think in 2002, 2008, we had one other employee, and so it was really just a few of us up until 2008.
Which is interesting because, because of him, no offense, but it has a bit of a reputation as something of a legendary firm, right? And I think more people would think there were more employees or bigger staff or something like that. That might come as a surprise to a lot of our listeners, I think.
Yeah, well, it did start out, small and controlled, but then it really took off, not surprisingly in 2009. That's really when we started to grow, and then we grew very rapidly. We just to fast forward where we are today, we're about 80 employees, and have 100 plus clients and do a whole range of things, but we did start out small, and then beginning in 2009, as I said, we really started to put some focus on growth. I say this with total affection, but I think David viewed our side of it as sort of a for-profit hobby. It wasn't, his primary focus, but it was mine. And so starting in 2009, we really started to get focused on building and growing the company. And we opened our office in DC towards the end of 2009. There was some interest in us in Washington in 2009, and so I had one colleague and I going back and forth to DC for work, and then we started to build that team, and that went very, very well for us. And then in 2010, I worked on a project in New York, and I met my now partner, Maggie Moran. She was a client of mine at that time, and an amazing practitioner. And so we got to know each other, and she was interested in getting into this area of work. And so we, at the time, she was also interested in building a company. And so we ended up backing her and supporting the development of a company that did the same thing that then ASGK did, but focused more on New York and New Jersey. And so that went incredibly well. And in about 2015, we Maggie and I both realized that we were in this for the long haul, and we had this legacy name of what was then ASGK, and I was the only one left.
You were the S.
I was
right?
the S,
right.
And so I was the only one left, and people couldn't remember the name, and it didn't make a lot of sense. And Maggie was running this entity on public affairs, and so we decided in 2015 that we were going to rebrand.
Right.
And we had some ideas about what we wanted to do, and ultimately that's how we now are all at Kivvit.
Right. And where does the name Kivvit come from?
Well, Kivvit is derived from a native Alaskan word that means durable.
Okay.
Although Maggie and I had some very clear ideas of what we wanted. In this industry, a lot of the firms are named after people,
sure,
or they're something that's very literal. And we both felt like, hey, if we're going to do this, let's do it in a way that makes some sense for our culture.
Right.
And we both really wanted to have a single word, not something that was personalized around any person, but that could really be something that people could rally around in the firm. And so we went through a bit of a process, and we arrived at Kivvit.
Right. Okay, I won't ask you what the other contenders were. I think in the I think in the WPP case, there's just seemed to be a lot of firms nowadays named after just mishmashes of letters thrown together in some order, some not order.
You can tell between the initials of the founders,
yeah,
and then mergers happen, and it's ABC dash some word, it's a little, becomes a mouthful.
Naming a firm has got to be one of the most difficult challenges of the industry.
But I think what you mentioned.
Everybody's so judgmental.
I think what you mentioned is really interesting. I had no idea Kivvit was a Native American term. I had no idea that's where it came from.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's very cool.
So let's take a brief step back. So you joined the firm in 2002. Chicago is known for, is it fair to call it brass knuckle politics?
It
I
is.
bet you had some interesting characters stopping by the office at one time or another, right?
Yeah, we did. It was, Chicago's a great place to have learned politics. I spent about my first decade doing politics and government. Although I feel like, these days, New York and of course Washington, they have all their own. They'll give anybody a run for their money. But Chicago was a great place to learn.
Well, it was a fascinating thing being here when we got into fall of 2016. And I mean, just from a logistics standpoint, I'm thinking of guys I played softball with who were police officers talking about how much, the city was spending the night of election night taking care of two, victory parties, one of which actually turned out to be a victory party and one didn't, of course. But you had, one at Javits and then one in Midtown. And it really was, interestingly, the center of the universe, even though, nobody ever stops here to campaign. So it was very interesting in that respect. But okay, so you worked with David for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like when he then in goes and leaves to work on the Obama campaign full time?
Well, you
Would
know,
that have
it
been
was,
07 or?
that would have been, yeah, 06 even. Certainly, yeah, 06, 07. You know, it was exciting and sort of terrifying at the same time for me. Very exciting because, you know, David and I were close. I got to have some visibility into seeing what David was doing, and there was obviously a lot of excitement about Obama. But from a business standpoint, it was pretty nerve-wracking. David was, you know, had been the face of the firm and very important in that sense. So it was, there was a lot of unknowns, and when David, I knew that David was going to go into the White House, so I can still remember, and it would have been, you know, towards the end of 2008 after the election, he said, no surprise here, you know, I'm going to Washington, but you know, I'm sure you'll do okay. And it turned out okay, turned out more than okay. But yeah, it was a transition. It was definitely a transition. But all in all, it was very, very exciting, and I was very, very, you know, happy for him, and it was a great thing to have been able to see a bit of.
Right. So fast forward 10 years later. What are your clients talking about now? What are the issues that concern them? You know, what's on their minds?
Well, we're, you know, in our heart and soul, we're a public affairs firm. So the vast majority of work that we do is communication to influence government and other sort of stakeholders like that. And so for a whole variety of reasons, there's been, you know, there's so much fluidity in terms of what's going on with public issues. And it's evolved. There was a period of time where, you know, anytime you have an election, you have a new president, and this is true if you have a new governor or even a new mayor, there's all sorts of expectations about what are the issues going to be, how's it going to affect different kinds of industries. It was that, but at just a whole other scale because of, you know, the unique nature of Trump's communication style, and also more substantively, you know, the lack of clarity around what his politics and policies were going to be, because he's not a conventional Republican the way that he's lined up on certain issues. So for us, it was, and I think it continues to be, from a business standpoint, ironically, and it's not just us, you know, it's a very busy time. If you look at what's going on with spending and with lobbying and public affairs in Washington, it's very robust. So, you know, we work in a whole cross-section of industries. We work in energy and healthcare and tech and all the industries that you would expect. And, you know, I think one of the unusual dynamics that's been at play for a while now is that the economy and the companies are generally doing well in many respects, but there are these very, very serious regulatory issues that are happening to varying degrees. And so there's a lot of importance that's being placed on public affairs, and how do we communicate, and do we really understand our stakeholders, and are we prepared for the policy issues on the substantive side, and are we prepared for the reputational issues should, you know, companies have the misfortune to get caught into some of these political crosshairs.
Yeah. When Trump first came into office, or even before that, did clients come to you and say, well, what if he tweets about us? What do we do next? Was that something that you ran into?
Sure, we sure did. And, you know, the truth is that it was uncharted territory. And so we can look back now and say, well, you can ride things out and it depends on the seriousness of the issue. But if you go back and you really think about at the time, some of those first instances, I remember the Ford instance, and there were plenty of others. You know, it was so unconventional and nobody had ever experienced it that it was hard to say, well, here's precisely what you do. But we went through this with a number of different clients. We had clients that had that got caught up inadvertently on some issues related to the administration. And it not only, you know, one of the things that we experienced with some of our clients was it wasn't only being attacked by Trump, but it was being in a situation where you might be aligned with Trump on a policy issue, and then having a backlash from certain segments of your consumers. Right. We had a very high-profile retail client that had that happen too, where they inadvertently got caught up on an issue, and then it created a backlash where customers were, you know, burning shoes and posting things in social media. And
Are we talking about New Balance here? Because this
Yeah.
this sounds awfully familiar to me.
We did work for New Balance, and so it was a learning process. Again,
Yeah.
I think anybody that went through it was learning as we were going.
I think that is a really fascinating case study, and then I think there's also the Keurig one. But you know, and this keeps it's such an unconventional period, and whether you have just one thing I think about of how brands have to be prepared for any sort of bizarre political thing to happen is that instance in 2017 where in a weirdly similar thing, the band Depeche Mode then has to put out a statement saying that we dislike white supremacists because some group of white supremacists claims Depeche Mode is the whitest band ever, and thus they're their official band, and they have to actually step in and release a statement on it. And it's a crazy thing to think about it because, you know, there's absolutely no playbook for that, is there?
There isn't. I'm from Detroit, and I remember there was a period of time where the Detroit Red Wing hockey
Right.
logo was getting adopted by white supremacists. And, you know, to me, again, understanding that it was all uncharted territory, I think that the most important lesson is to really focus on your core stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
to focus on your employees, to focus on your core customers, the core stakeholders that matter to your business. Make sure you're communicating effectively in a way that's timely and accurate and truthful, and the rest of the noise tends to work itself out, although it doesn't feel that way, you know, when you're right in the heat of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the news of the week. So the shutdown is continuing to be the big story. What is your main takeaway as somebody who does this professionally, who's sort of on the front lines of how brands react or what they're concerned about? What is your takeaway in terms of the folks that are your clients that you're talking to all the time? What are they most worried about with the shutdown?
You know, the shutdown, there's substance, and then there's kind of the back and forth of who's, you know, winning the news of the day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, look, I think substantively there's just incredible frustration. You see the economic impact projections, you see the human toll that it's taking. You know, I travel a lot, I've been traveling a bit during this time. You see the toll that it's taking on employees, and it's easy to sort of dismiss 800,000 people in the abstract. It's a little different when you actually are seeing people and the impact that it's having. So I think that there's a frustration that there are ways to deal with policy differences that don't have to really affect the economy in a macro way and affect human beings in a very literal way. So there's that. You know, if you look at sort of who's winning the issue of the day, you know, if you look at the polls, it does look like that the public is blaming Trump disproportionately for the shutdown. You see efforts to sort of, I mean, this was going on over the last day, you know, to try to advance legislation that both sides know isn't going to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a hope that we're kind of reaching the 11th hour here and that something will happen, but it does underscore, you know, you've got an unconventional president who, you know, really does things his own way. You know, you having just elected a Democratic House, so there's not a lot of, even if there had been a willingness to work together, there's not a lot of familiarity for, you know, how you do that. And so I do think it's been a bit of a perfect storm. You know, I think people just hope that it doesn't settle into, you know, a new normal. I do worry a little bit that the longer it goes on, the more people, you know, get accustomed to it. Mm-hmm. But hopefully this will get itself resolved, although it's not obvious exactly how that's going to happen. And I don't think that the tussle over the State of the Union, you know, is helping things.
No, I agree with you. And, you know, we have to talk about the comms aspect of it as well. And you mentioned that people are disproportionately blaming Trump for it, which, you know, in my opinion is because he went on TV and said, I'll take credit for the shutdown, which I'm sure he has some regrets about. But we were talking briefly before we started recording about how a lot of his supporters aren't really helping his case. You know, his daughter-in-law didn't make a great case for the shutdown on TV the other day. And, you know, the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, made a really big gaffe today when he was on CNBC talking about, well, why can't people who are out of work just take out a loan? So, I mean, it does seem like the Democrats have been a lot more disciplined. Is that your take as well?
Well, they definitely haven't had those unforced errors. The one thing that you can make a reasonable assumption about is that we do know that Trump tends to sort of fly a little bit by the seat of his pants and make decisions on the fly. And I do think that, you know, whatever people think about the policy side of it, again, just from a kind of a communication and sort of tactic standpoint, that you can figure that Pelosi and the House Democrats are thinking some steps ahead here. And so, you know, these unforced errors that Trump has had because of the comments from his daughter-in-law and from Ross, I think will, you know, show that there's probably more risk for Trump, again, leaving aside the important issues, I'm talking just really from a political standpoint, you know, that there are more risks for Trump the longer this goes on.
Mm-hmm. And Diana, we did a story last week, I think, about how brands were stepping in to help out a bit during the shutdown. Can you give us a quick rundown on that?
Sure. I know that Uber or Airbnb is offering a free night to people affected. And I know that Uber and Lyft are also offering some discounts, and T-Mobile. So it's really cutting across all you know, industries, all kinds.
I'm all for this sort of thing. I am.
Yeah,
Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, when I see initiatives like that, or like when I see the Domino's ad about, you know, we'll come and pave the potholes in your neighborhood, it's just
it's sad.
it leaves me with this sense of why aren't your tax dollars actually going to fix this? But anyway, but I am for it. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, other big news from this past weekend is this kind of dueling rallies that happened in Washington, and the kids from Covington Catholic. And as a professional communicator, what is your take on this? What was your initial reaction to this whole situation?
Probably pretty similar to everybody else's, you know, and again, I think it is a real lesson. Again, I think there's sort of like what happened in the moment, and then there's what have we learned subsequently. You know, I think that the image of the young teenager with what looked like a little bit of a smirk on his face, and the Native American, you know, the rush to the kind of obvious expectation was that you had, you know, this dynamic where this young kid was being disrespectful, and you know, all of this has been commented on. It's clear that when you see that little snippet, that's the way it looked. I do think there's an open question as to, you know, how did it come to be that, given everything that we know now, that for the first news cycle of this, it was all covered in that context. And then, as we all know, after you see the broader context, you know, you realize it's not that simple. I'm not sure that there's an obvious good guy and bad guy in all of this. I think that there's, in retrospect, probably some blame to have gone around. But I think the lesson being that when you are looking at these little brief snippets, it is very easy to mischaracterize and misunderstand everything that happened. And I do think that that's a lesson to learn. I don't think that's about fake news and all those kind of issues, but I do think it's when you're dealing with little snippets of information off somebody's phone, you don't have the full context, you do see that there really was a rush to judgment that was at least incomplete.
Yeah, and it also brings to mind just how easy it is to have a hot take on Twitter, which there were a lot of, and then there were a lot of apologies for them in the days after. So I guess that's a bit of a lesson learned. I wonder if people will actually take a step back before they tweet now, but I doubt it.
I doubt it. I think that there's so much pressure to be first that this is where you run into these issues, that there's so much pressure to get out there, and you can say, well, you know, more to come as we get more information, but it was, in retrospect, you know, we definitely did not get the complete picture.
Right. Also this week, Davos. Do you have any clients at Davos? And if so, what are they talking about?
Yeah, we do. You know, our clients that are involved are talking about a lot of these big issues. We do some work with some international oriented clients, and you know, you have these big global macro issues that are going on with different kinds of, the issues that we all know about that are going on in Europe with Brexit. You have issues around trade and these big issues. So our clients are trying to both, I think, give a point of view and be part of that big dialogue, but at the same time, want to, I think, also make the case for, why what they do is important. And, you alluded to this a little bit before, increasingly companies and business leaders are being expected to weigh in on these big policy issues. And sometimes that works well, sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's a little less so. But I think that that's part of what's going on, is that because there is a view that government is not working in every instance, again, not only in the United States, but you look again at what's going on in Europe and some other places, that there's at least an expectation that the private sector and these major corporations and these major business leaders are going to have points of view about issues. So I think it's those things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the one thing that jumps out off the page to me about Davos this year is, of course, the president isn't there. Theresa May is not there. There are other, the Prime Minister of Canada is not there.
France, I know, China.
Right, so it feels a little empty, at least reading about it from afar. But the issues obviously keep going on the ground there.
Yeah, they do, although I have to tell you, I saw this, and I can't remember which media outlet, but there was a sign to get to an event, and I'm paraphrasing this, but the event was something along the lines of, what's happening with the world's refugee crisis, and then in the same font it said, private drivers turn left. And I think that there is.
I don't know whether to laugh or cry.
Yeah, and it was in the exact same font, and I kept thinking, somebody printed this, somebody looked at it, somebody approved this, and it does speak a little bit to some of the disconnect of what's going on in terms of people talking about these big global issues. But I always come back to where is the implementation? How do you actually start to affect some of these things? So I guess we can give people credit for at least talking about them. Maybe a little bit more on the implementation side would be good.
And let me throw out a shameless plug here. If you happen to be on the internet at any time in the next week, you should go to PRWeek.com and check out our on-the-ground coverage from Cannes, from Davos, where our own Steve Barrett and Maya Samuel are on the ground and giving us snippets every day for the breakfast briefing. And also, we have some podcasts with communications leaders from companies like PayPal and Procter & Gamble, and also a big wrap-up blog that is just posted on the website about all the biggest issues at Davos this year. So check that out if you get a chance. So I just mentioned Procter & Gamble, and Eric, I'm going to mention that you are clean shaven and I am not. So you are probably more the expert on the Gillette Ad than I might be. So what were your initial?
That's a great segue.
Thank you. That's a bit of a stretch. Anyway, so what were your thoughts on the Gillette Ad and the response to it? This is a case where we're seeing polls in reaction to it being a little bit all over the place.
Well, I guess it depends how you ultimately define success. From a pure creative and from an ad, from a sort of insider industry standpoint, I generally agree with what I've seen as the bulk of the commentary. That I think that Gillette should get some credit for being willing to weigh into a controversial issue, but the creative execution I think did miss the mark. And having had my work armchair quarterback many times, I'll just armchair quarterback this one. I wonder how it would have come across if it would have been, more of a documentary style, a little bit more of a news-oriented style. I think what was clumsy about it was you had these actors doing these overly simplistic recounting of the most obnoxious things that men could do, and so it just looked a little silly in that sense. But I think that companies deserve credit for being willing to weigh into these societal issues, and sometimes they will get it right, and sometimes they will get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that it is probably something that we're going to see more of.
Right.
Now, again, it depends how you define success. I looked, I think, yesterday, and there were over 10 million, views of this ad, and they didn't even put it on television. And so, you can look at it from a marketing and branding standpoint, and I guess we'll see how that plays itself out in the weeks ahead. And you can look at it from a more kind of civic, reputational standpoint. And the truth is, whether it was intended or not, it's created a major conversation.
Yeah.
I hope that the underlying issues don't get lost in the commentary around the creative, because I do think, as I said, it's an important issue, not an easy one for brands to address. So I think they get some credit for at least being willing to be out there on that issue, even if the execution might have left something to be desired.
We ran a poll on our site last week, and a lot of people agree with you, actually. We said, we put out the question, was Gillette's ad a fail? And 48% of our readers said brands should speak up. 34% said that attention equals success, and 18% said Gillette was just trying too hard with the ad. So, all in all, it sounds pretty positive. But then there were other numbers released this week from Maven Magnet. They said that their aim with the film may have been to support women and end toxic masculinity, but 37% of women online had a negative reaction to the spot.
I personally think the term toxic masculinity is very tough to define. So I mean, what specifically are we talking about when we say toxic masculinity? I've always found that to be a easier said than done argument, especially in a case like this.
Yeah.
There are more examples of. There are examples out there where companies have, I think, done this remarkably well. When this whole controversy happened, it reminded me of the Dove campaign about faces and how women describe themselves, and the sketches, I think it was called. And to me, that was a really thoughtful and well conceived and well executed campaign. And other brands have done variations of this. Starbucks has been involved in another kind of public issues, and of course Nike. So again, I think that companies deserve credit for being willing to get to weigh in on these issues, but you do have to do it in a way that's consistent with your brand, and ultimately you hope enhances your reputation as you're contributing to these issues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a good point of view. So speaking of polls, Diana, which you mentioned, there is a trivia game that my segues are really killing us.
Yes. Yeah.
So speaking of polls and a certain trivia game that takes advantage of polls, this was my favorite account move story of the week, was about HQ Trivia.
Yes. The live quiz app, for those of you who don't know or remember.
Eric, were you a HQ Trivia player?
I was not, no.
Never?
No, I didn't do it.
Even in its heyday?
Uh-uh.
Oh, wow.
I was in the heyday, but it was really burning through my battery in a hurry whenever I played. I noticed that, so.
I mean, my mom still plays pretty religiously, and she'll tell me what her score is. I think she's won like $2 total.
Has she ever won the grand prize? Has she ever gotten all the way to the last question?
She's won about $2 total.
$2 total.
In the past couple of years, yeah.
Okay.
But she's very proud of that $2, as she should be. It's hard. I never won. Did you ever go?
I never won.
No.
I never got close.
No. I think the closest I got was 9 questions.
And Diana, who sits next to me all day, will tell you I'm full of completely random and useless knowledge, and
I know,
I
I'm
never
shocked
got
you didn't win.
Anywhere near the end. So.
Wow.
Anyway, sorry.
You should try it again. Sounds like there's fun things coming up for the app. So they've brought on a new PR partner, Covert Creative. They started working with HQ on January 14th, and they'll help as HQ announces many exciting partnerships in the near future. And actually earlier this week, HQ hosted a special musical themed show for Rent Live, which is airing this Sunday on Fox, I believe.
I think we can call that sponsored content, right?
Yeah, I believe so. And so they're giving away Rent for 1 year to one randomly selected winner from contestants who answered all the questions correctly via a sponsorship agreement with Fox, and Covert kind of helped to promote that particular event, and they'll be doing things like that going forward. So yeah.
Covert's a really interesting shop. Covert's an interesting shop. Obviously, Cadillac is their big client.
Yeah,
and that was a stunner when they won that one. No offense to them, but they weren't considered a front runner for it when it started.
Well, yeah, Covert launched in early 2016 by PMK-BNC veterans Louis K. and Joseph Assad, who are the co-CEOs of the firm. And they represent celebrities and brands. As you said, Covert's biggest client is Cadillac. They've worked with Cadillac as global PRAOR since April 2016. So, yeah, it's pretty impressive.
I'm interested to see what they have in mind for them, because that's an interesting shop, and HQ is not as popular as it once was.
No, they've had a lot of issues lately.
Interested to see how they try to get the rebound here.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 public service announcements. We have extended deadlines for the Grand Film Festival in New York and the PRWeek Global Awards. You can find links to both of those on our website. So Eric, thank you very much for joining us this week. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
And Diana, thank you for co-hosting. This is Frank Washkuch, News Director at PRWeek, and we will see you for next week's podcast. Thank you very much.